getting hard in the, okay, what's the bloody data model for this, right? And I know you're not there yet, but.
I mean, I think we all have a data model in our head, but what I'm still trying to get at is that, I mean, I know that everything is frames all the way down for you.
Yep.
I personally am still trying to convince you that that may be true for one implementation, not necessarily the other. And I don't think we should aim to align on implementations right now. If we can align on system boundaries and interrupt formats, that would be a better first start. So
I understand where you're coming from, and it's not wrong in many ways, but I'm saying frames, okay, there's really two aspects of frames, right? One is as a formalism, and one is as the atom of the interrupt format. Like, what is the interrupt format? Is it JSON-ish? Is it RDF-ish? Is it this or that? And I'm proposing to use frames as a kind of essential building block. Now, it's entirely possible that those frames can be expressed as JSON-LD, for example, or in which case they're JSON, which makes a lot of nice things happen.
To decide on that, we first need to know what the whether or not what are the system boundaries and what should be sent, like semantically, what are the contracts across these system boundaries, and then we can talk about whether or not frames are suitable. So I think you're getting ahead of yourself by instantly jumping to the frames conclusion.
I am.
It may not be correct.
But I am asking, it's not just what are the system boundaries, what are we trying to share, right? What is
exactly, what are the system boundaries?
Yeah, yes, but it's more than just the boundary. That's the definition of what gets across the boundary, which is for me a distinct object. And then we get into modeling.
Yep. But
I
so,
understand what you're saying.
hi, Tim.
Good.
A lot of the discussion on Friday I heard was about what I call two different types of claims, contextual claims and isolated claims. I think isolated is maybe another good way to call what we've been calling the potato claim in the glossary. Because in essence, that's what it is. You're trying
we had standalone at some point.
Yeah. That was my intent, and it still is. And I think Timothy is very much aligned on that the purpose of the CDL is to only consider those. And for me, that's why I see a clear system boundary. I understand where you come from, One, when you say, oh, but I want contextual claims. Because indeed, as Jamie's process highlights, it is relevant, and it is also relevant to couple of contextual claims to standalone or isolated claims, or what CDL claims, whatever you want to call them. Yep. But exactly in that sentence, it's already pretty much entailed that these are potentially two different
distinct objects. Yeah. What I keep saying, however, is that the relation between contextual and standalone is not essentially different from the disambiguation relation between pure so-called pure standalone claims.
I think it is, and I think we can try to dig into that exactly, because I heard a bit of that indeed in the conversation on Friday. So that would be my suggested meeting agenda for today. I don't know whether or not we should start that with doing some user stories first. It sounds like we do have a good understanding of the difference between what, let's call them contextual claim and isolated claim for now.
Yeah, let's call them standalone. I really like the standalone.
Full circle. Yeah, I mean, I'm okay with standalone. Timothy, is there anything that you prefer to focus on?
No, I'm okay. I mean, I have lots of interests that I'd be willing to talk about, but that's a good one. Also, I'm driving and walking around, so I'm going to be kind of mute and no mic, no video for a while, but I'll try to participate.
Okay. So it sounds like we have agreement on the distinction between these two types of claims. Oh, hi, Joshua. Then maybe Antoine, you can paraphrase that decision so we can also immediately see whether we aligned.
Yeah. What we are speaking about is the distinction, the relation between Well, first, there's a distinction between standalone claims. That is what we've been trying to define all along. At some point was potato claim, good claim, but the notion that it's a claim that can be understood without reference with provenance or its context provenance, and contextual claim. The claim, it's taken from a provenance and a lot of its meaning derives from its original context. And there's a relation between those, which is a relation of interpretation, which is saying, I think that this claim in context can be interpreted as this standalone claim. And an argument I'm making, and this is something we'll check with user stories, is that there is a relationship between ambiguous standalone claim and less ambiguous standalone claim, which is essentially, I'm claiming it's essentially the same relation. I'm claiming there's no, yes, there is a difference whether considering a claim in context or not, but there is the relationship of interpretation is fundamentally the same, whether it applies to a contextual claim or to a pair of standalone claims.
Okay, so maybe before kicking off that discussion, we can check in whether everyone has the same understanding of like standalone claim and then the undefined contextual claim. Standalone claim is essentially the one we have on the glossary right now. It's the one with a clearly demarcated stuff that makes up the claim that as a whole you can assess as true or false. In very short words, if you want the full definition, you can check the glossary. To contrast that with contextual claims, we're talking about like, oh, it's a claim being made in an article. And the context might matter. And that's the bit that is a bit undefined, which I think is exactly where some of the disagreements may come from. So one thing we can do is try to define that more. Another thing we can do is try to write down user stories why interacting with standalone claims is different from these contextual claims, or we can instantly jump into the disagreement, which I personally, and I think Mike Antoine as well, has a pretty good understanding of. I'm fine with whatever. But Joshua, to ask you the question, do you understand the distinction?
Hi, everyone. Nice to see you. Again, I'm frankly, obviously I haven't been able to attend in a little while, so I'm catching up. I was just looking at Trello board. Let me just listen at first, okay, and I'll jump in later when I feel more caught up.
Yeah, one thing you can do is go over the current consensus. There's quite a lot in there, and you can. It would have been nice to do that before the meeting, of course, but I understand that you didn't find time to do that. So it's something you can do after the meeting then. Yeah. Okay, so the point of, okay, maybe let's just try to write down the user stories first, so we have something to work from.
I just like to throw in a little monkey wrench or a little complication, which is the following question. My guess is that a contextual claim is like you pull a sentence out of the document, right? And then you're creating like an interpretation by saying, I think they meant this by that, right?
I think there's already two things going on here. I think there's the contextual claim and there's an interpretation, which maybe is even another claim. But yes, I think we're on board there.
So the contextual claim is the sentence you pulled out of the book, right? Correct?
Mark Antoine, you're muted.
Yeah, oddly enough, because you aren't, but we can't hear you.
Yeah.
Or your headset has lost its battery. Or there's a cloud over
Canada. You're typing on your keyboard. You just keep typing and typing, and it's erasing your words.
He's on his tablet right now. He's not on the laptop. Uh-oh, technical issues.
Bummer. Good. My purpose for asking this question, I'll just go ahead, it seems to me in the same category is what somebody might call the underlying thesis, right? What is the underlying thesis of the Communist Manifesto? What is the underlying thesis of this book? What is the underlying whatever? The reason I bring this up is it's another like kind of, it's a claim about a document that is an interpretation of the document as a whole. And I imagine there'd be shared elements there between interpreting a contextual claim and interpreting what you consider to be the thesis of the whole document. So that's just the monkey wrench I'm throwing out there. Maybe maybe we can leave that for another time. Yeah.
Okay, let's try to write it up as user stories. And Mike and Tron, in the meantime, you can try to.
Yeah, try again.
You're back. You're back.
Okay, good. Yeah, by the way, just Tim and Joshua, my computer died this morning, so I'll be operating from tablet for a few days. Joy. The Monterey install was not innocuous. So the distinction I was trying to bring is when you said it's the sentence pulled from a document, I would say with provenance. And there is another thing as the sentence pulled from the document without provenance. They may be distinct objects, but here I do mean with provenance. Second, as for this is a kind of overall interpretation of the document. Here's the claim, and it may be not anchored in text. That's a different object. And this could be the global interpretation, like interpretation of some things in the document. But ideally, you could ground it in a passage, just a longer passage, or maybe the whole thing. But it could be, here is an interpretation of the document.
So the key distinction I want to make, and I also wrote this in Hangouts, is you know that the original definition of standalone claim was very broad. We said, yes, it could incorporate a full book even. And I think that's similar to what you're saying. We could consider a paragraph with one claim highlighted in it as a standalone claim, and the full paragraph essentially providing the context, but the demarcated context to define how that claim should be interpreted. That, for me, is a key distinction to make with a contextual claim where you don't have that demarcation. Essentially, or the demarcation is subjective. You don't formalize where the demarcation lies. And I think that's the common, yeah, exactly. That's the common use case, I think, of contextual claims. What I would call a contextual claim is indeed you have a web page, and within the web page, a claim is made. You highlight the position, etc. In and of itself, you just have a piece of text that might not even be a claim. So it's actually more like a contextual sentence. In and of itself, that's nothing. And you point to the resource as in, well, that's a context, but you don't say where the end of the context lies, because a web page can have links. A video can have like one segment of dialogue, but it can also be the full video. Like there's no clear formalization of where the context starts or ends. That to me is a contextual claim in the most common, and I would like to write something like that up as a user story, because I think that's the most common operation. You're not gonna, in an everyday interaction, say, well, I'm gonna make a contextual claim, but you should only consider this paragraph. You're gonna point to a resource and say, this sentence here, I wanna talk about. At that point, it might not even be a claim yet.
Okay, that's very interesting. Let's so there would be three kinds of objects that way, right? There would be the really standalone claim. We've forgotten the provenance. We've erased the provenance. There's the fully provenance, this sentence from this document, and there's kind of an in-between state where we've extracted a bit of context, saying, is this sentence, and consider that context. But I would argue that this context, let's say the paragraph, itself could be with or without its provenance. Like the provenance could have been kept or erased.
Exactly. If you're interested in adding a paragraph to the CDL, but we are not. We're only interested in adding claims to the CDL.
Right. But what I'm saying is that a fundamental type distinction, right? Like for me, the without provenance is a fundamental type distinction. The case where we express a claim, whether standalone or contextual, as here's a block of text, and within that block of text, here's a subpart that's the actual claim, and the rest is context for that claim.
That even isn't enough, and I think we went over that. But I think that let's write up that part as a user story, and then we can identify entities. That's going to make it easier. Let's first try to establish like this scenario, which I think is indeed what we're talking about. So
Okay.
the first question is, who is doing this? Is it the author of the article itself, or is it, because already there, I think there's a slight distinction, it might overlap, but is there any of the two we want to focus on? Is it like people reading the article that are going to extract claims, or is it the author making claims more explicit within the article?
I would focus on readers rather than the author, but both are valid use cases.
Yeah, I'm fine focusing on either. I think they're just
contributor
separate,
really.
separate use cases, slightly.
Yeah.
But
We
so
could
as
say
a,
as a contributor, really, because you're going to contribute a claim to the system from reading that article.
Let's see later, because right now it is like you are reading an article, right?
Okay.
As a reader of, let's call it just an article for now, but it could be any media. I want to highlight. What do we want to do? We want to highlight. We want to, like, essentially. Let me try writing something without thinking out loud. Something along those lines. So that I'm struggling with a bit, but I guess it would be to discuss it.
Yeah. Question. Do you suppose the usable claim pre-exists, or could you create it on the fly?
That's a good question. I didn't, as you notice, I hesitated what to write here. But the key thing here, is that whether or not it pre-exists or not, it's going to be an isolated claim, standalone claim, usable claim, potato claim. So what is really happening here is you have provenance, you have some subset of the provenance you want to highlight, and you have the action of saying this thing I want to interpret as, and then an isolated claim.
Yes.
That's the full user story. So there's many things involved.
That's a fundamental user story. We agree.
So what you in essence do is you take something that's highly contextual and you say, I think what the author is trying to say here is this, something that can then next be discussed out of context.
Yep.
So actually, maybe that's even so that can be discussed in a broader context.
Sounds good. I would say I would specify that as an existing or new usable claim, or maybe we want to separate them. But let's be explicit about this.
Yep, agreed. I just don't know how to best write it.
As a parenthesis, newer existing.
Yeah, I think usable is the best definition we have for it now. I would.
Yeah,
I would have to go for now. Actually, maybe it's best if I keep it open.
Yes.
But yeah, I think usable claim is the closest to what to what we mean here. So we have, of course, article.
Yeah, because the obvious axis of generalization is from article to any piece of any document or piece of media, right?
Media source, let's call it maybe.
Yep.
Because I agree with that generalization. I want to highlight. Then this
a fragment.
Begs the question. Yeah, but a fragment, yeah. Fragment subset.
Because that is well defined in web annotation standards. We can point to that.
Fragments. I'm fine with fragments. And link it. And suggest the link can be removed. The suggestion is linking. So usable claim is still in there. We have that. Oh, I'm adding it to actives. And then claim repository, good old infamous thing we never defined. Because this is where it starts mattering. The claim repository would be CDL. Now, where the question is, where will the provenance and the fragment live? And for me, that's a separate bounded context that just links to the CDL. And yes, before you're going to say, but the CDL should also be aware about it because there are useful user stories for that. You highlighted some of them in the last meeting. Yes, two-way linking is probably essential. But the only
I was
boundary
actually going
between...
to say, I agree with you. I mean, clearly, this is out of scope of Tim's definition of CDL. So yeah, it has to be another bounded context. So we have the, how should I put it? The interpretation repository, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's essential because it is a different domain. It is what Timothy would say outside of scope of the CDL, but it is very important within a bigger ecosystem of what CDL tries to accomplish, as Jamie's projects are a prime example.
Yeah, it's totally in scope for society library.
But I think why Timothy and I have this inclination of starting with the claim repository, the isolated claim repository, usable claim repository, is because it builds on top of it, right? It's like I think what we need to uncover next, if there's no questions around this user story, is like what is the intersection between contextual claims and usable claims? Is it only linking, or are there more user stories that would require strongly linking between the two? I think that will ultimately determine whether or not they can or should be separate systems.
Right. Well, the reason I've been always saying I wouldn't separate them is because for me they have so many mechanisms in common, including disambiguation mechanism, which is really the hard work in both cases. And for me, the interpretation mechanism and the disambiguation mechanism are essentially the same thing. So
it sounds like we should probably add user stories about the disambiguation mechanism, because for me, there are different disambiguation mechanisms. In one, you're trying to interpret based on the full undemarcated context of the contextual claim what the author might have meant. And then indeed mechanisms, as you say, like you're trying to find the most, I would say, consistent interpretation, depending on what is known of other things that the author might have said. And in this case, it might not even be the full book. It might be all the other books the author has written to provide the best interpretation of that claim of provenance.
Yeah, that is common.
This to me is a different process and a different user story. You can try to write it up than disambiguating an isolated claim, where by default anything that's not formalized, because the only thing you look at when you're trying to interpret the claim is the whole of the claim itself. Anything that isn't formalized is purposefully ambiguous or by accident, but is open for discussion. There is no such thing as making an argument, oh, but the author meant this.
Yeah. And the reason I'm saying it's the same thing is that we have to handle the same use cases of conflict, curation. The idea is, for me, the standalone claim was introduced by somebody who had an intent, and then we can ask, what is the intent? Now, even if we decide we don't care, we are still looking at giving multiple concurrent interpretations.
I think you violated the definition of standalone claim there. I'm fine with addressing the intent of the contextual claim linked to the standalone claim, and sure, you can do that, but you should not confuse it with the intent. The standalone claim, the isolated claim, is what it is. There is no such intent as who added it. The point is that you can discuss it in isolation. I'm not saying that it might not be useful to, from an isolated claim, look up the contextual claims with linked interpretations and discuss those, whether or not that was the actual intent of the contextual claims, but that's not the intent of the isolated claims.
What I'm saying, and this is a discussion we've had often, for me, it's contextual claim. Okay, standalone claim is aspirational. any claim is aiming towards standalone. It never is standalone. That means there's always a bit of the writer's intent. And even if it was written as standalone by a moderator in the claim repository, there is still an intent. Now, what you can say, which is entirely valid, is we can choose to disregard that intent when interpreting the claim. And that's fine. We don't care. It's true. And
I would say more than that. It's a necessity for what we have unlabeled as claim repository here to work, because you cannot. The whole point is that you have many different intents for the claim being added to centralize them in one place. If you have to look at all of them or decide which one to look at individually, the purpose of having an isolated claim is gone. The whole point of adding an isolated claim is exactly to not have to look at the intent.
Well, the question for me is, you're looking at an isolated claim. The question is it ambiguous, right? And more important, is the ambiguity, and we decided there's two cases of ambiguity, right? There's where
you call it
homonymy, let's say homonymy and nuance, let's call them that way, right? For now. And maybe that's something we need to put in the glossary.
We should.
I'm not putting anything anywhere today until I have a new computer. When we're looking at the standalone claim, if we think it's ambiguous, because if we find that it's used in a way that surprises us, because, oh, this is not compatible with my interpretation, my intuitive interpretation, not my interpretation, materialized interpretation, but my mental interpretation, then I will want to say, oh, actually, I see two possible interpretations of this usable claim, and I will introduce it to interpretations. This is our it depends we were talking about. And I'll say this interpretation makes sense in as, for example, support, or, this claim under this interpretation makes sense in this other claim, but not under that interpretation. So I want to create a distinct interpretation and make it clear that any argument using that original usable claim should review whether it can still use it or whether it has to pick one of the interpretations, especially if it's a homonymy type.
Okay, and why?
I would propose, just to respond to that, I would propose a different resolution for that problem that you state.
Okay, go ahead.
Which is, instead of having to either create interpretations or rely on the original intent, you create another claim, which is like an interpretation, but instead of it being modeled as an interpretation, it's just another claim with a more specific version of that claim. Right?
I was about to say the same. That's how you would deal with this.
I think we're saying the same.
Let me finish. Yeah, and we are. I think we're all thinking and saying more or less the same thing. But just to finish off, the way you resolve that is, in the end, what you're going to have are multiple versions, and a definition of version there of the same claim, in which some might be contentious as to whether or not it's relevant when used as an argument, and others have a much clearer relevance. And so I think we just need the mechanism that kind of, and this might be a layer 2 thing, hides or removes the less relevant versions of the same claim rather than creating multiple, duplications of the same argument. But yeah, that's how I would propose a resolution is done, instead of recording or requesting or whatever the creator's intent.
If I just let me rephrase to hear if I heard you well, but I think I got it. You're saying if we're proposing a more precise claim than the original ambiguous claim, you don't see the point of linking it to the ambiguous claim and offering it as a replacement, but you're just proposing, let's add it in parallel. It will be found to be more relevant than the ambiguous original. And
So this kind of
eventually-
ends up being like the base layer versus layer 2 sort of thing, where the base layer has everything and the layer 2 is showing the best or whatever. The relationship between them, I hope, will be carried through the relationship between disambiguations or definitions and the structure. That's my hope with formalization. Without that, then we probably need an explicit relationship, right? But yes, there needs to be a relationship.
Okay, so you see the point for a relationship, but you're saying, but what I thought I heard, and so maybe I'm wrong, is that the relationship is not necessary and you're counting on the relevance to eliminate the ambiguous version. Did I hear that right? Because that makes the relationship redundant.
Right. That with another caveat, which is that maybe this can be done automatically with formalization, where if you're matching definitions, the conclusion and the premise, if they have matching definitions, they're going to be more relevant.
Right. Okay. For the record, I hear you. I see how it could work, but I'm very much -1 against this, or even -10, because for me, one great thing about making the relation explicit is that it would flag all other uses of that claim as needing revision.
But like I said, there should be a relationship, right? But
yeah, you said there should be a relationship, but you're saying you're counting on.
We're deviating from the topic, I think, because
yeah, we are.
I'm very confused whether which claims we're talking about, and the whole point here was trying to find that out. So maybe let's try to write it up as a user story first, and then let's see whether we agree on that. So I tried doing that right now. So I think what Tim is trying to say is this: as and probably contributor, I want to introduce what we've called isolated claim, usable claim, whatever, as a more specific claim of another usable claim, so that it can be made clear different interpretations of the original broader usable claim, essentially.
Yes.
A different matter, essentially, right? That's what we're doing. We're disambiguating to say, well, it depends. I'll write it in, I don't know. This is my best attempt so far. Are we aligned that that's one user story? I think that represents what Timothy is talking about, and I think I agree with that.
Is there some punctuation missing in your sentence?
Probably.
The last bit, I'm getting confused with the last part of your user story.
Oh, it's so that it can be made clear is weird grammar structure.
Yes, let's try to really pinpoint this so that it
would be, yeah.
What's the main reason for doing this?
I want to introduce a more specific claim to resolve ambiguity detected.
It's not just to resolve, to point it out also.
Yeah, I think so as well.
To identify,
well, yeah. It's identifying and resolving, basically. Yeah.
Not necessarily resolving, I think, because then the question is, how is it resolved? I think to identify...
Removing, not resolving, to remove perceived ambiguity in the original claim.
But it's not removed from the original claim, it's removed from the more specific one you've introduced.
Yeah, yeah.
So I think the main reason why you would want to link them is so that you can point out ambiguity. I'm more aligned with
I would say, listen, I think it's what I said, right? So that usage of the original ambiguous claim can be replaced with a more specific claim.
I think that's it. So that the original claim, so that it is made clear that the original claim can be ambiguous, essentially.
No, but it's more than that. So that any argument using the original claim can use one of the more specific versions.
Yeah, but are we implying here that should always happen? Because I'm
implying that it should always be flagged as an action needed. Now, the action may be indefinitely delayed, but I'm saying it should always be flagged so that when we
Okay, but that's a separate user story. I can agree with that, but for now,
yeah, there's multiple so that for this, right?
yeah.
Is the problem.
But I mean, the main point is really pointing out ambiguity, right?
Debate, like, so that it's easier to debate it. I don't know how to say that. So that it would be to remove disagreements on relevance of underlying arguments is another.
But how do you do that? It's precisely by replacing the use of the ambiguous claim and existing arguments by the less ambiguous claims. I am saying that is the core of the user story. I mean, whether you do it or not, but I'm saying the core of the user story is to say, okay, we've been using this ambiguous claim, let's replace it.
It makes sense. It makes sense to me that adding a flag that says this claim needs clarification is its own user story. And then once you know, then the subsequent user story would be addressing the flag.
What I'm saying is, what is the core user story? Why do I bother to make a more specific claim? It's because the usable claim has been used somewhere. This leads to ambiguity and misunderstanding, and I want to replace the ambiguous claim by the more.
Or the opposite.
The replacement is the goal.
Right. Or see, maybe not. Right. So there's more than one so that's a goal. I agree with that. It's a user story. We can put that one. The other one is maybe it hasn't been used anywhere. Maybe it's a top level debate. And you see that people are showing different interpretations. It's not that it has been used elsewhere. It's that interpretations seem to be varying according to the arguments that are being made on it, right? And you want to essentially maybe resolve both cases. You want to resolve the disagreements on relevance of supporting and opposing arguments.
And in a way, okay, fair enough. What you're saying is I'm speaking about past arguments and you're speaking about future arguments. Like, let's not use this claim in future arguments.
It could be past. It's arguments where the thing is the conclusion, right?
But it's usage in existing or future arguments. Like, basically the idea is, I'm not saying it's necessarily to replace it as a premise, it's to replace it in any argument that uses it.
Yeah, but my question still here is that always the intent? Because I'm okay with the flagging where you say, well, there are now more specific versions of this, but is it still the assumption that you have to select a more specific version? Is that the correct thing to do in all cases, or is this?
I think
no. And in fact, you can, like, the case I'm talking about, what I would really want to see is not a replacement, but a bifurcation.
Yeah, but that's you don't replace it. You introduce a new one as a, there's no replacing, just to be clear.
Right, I got it.
The question is more like, indeed, why are you doing this? So maybe we were going about it wrong and we...
Okay, can we put the replacement story? And if you have another story to add, let's write it. Because I think the replacement story is vital.
Okay, so I want to replace or suggest... is it instantly replace?
No, it's not instantly replaced. I want to create... The first part of the story was fine. I want to introduce one usable claim as a more specific claim so that usage of the ambiguous claim.
But where? Because we're not talking about where this claim is being used right now.
In existing or future arguments.
All links to the previous claim are rerouted to the clarified claim.
Not necessarily. I rewrite it to one of the clarifications. Because we don't know that there's only one. We're introducing one, but maybe we're introducing 2 or 3 or 4, and someone else may introduce another one. But what I'm saying is we know that anything that used the old one has to use this clarification or any other clarification of that original ambiguous claim.
Comme ça?
Much better, much happier with this.
I agree with this one, and this leaves open whether or not it should be replaced, because that is the main intent.
Yes, I agree. I'm not saying it has to be
And why?
replaced. I'm
And I
saying-
think there's many different user stories why these suggestions happen. Whether it's a conclusion or a premise or I think we have to leave that open. But the reason you want to make the connection actually probably the ambiguity itself becomes a thing we want to store is that reason. So you can suggest it at some point for whatever reason.
Yeah, this story is maybe there's other reasons to introduce.
If we're on board, well, maybe Timothy needs to confirm this still. If we're on board with this user story, what I want to do next is see why you think this is the same with a contextual claim. But I think does this make sense to you, Timothy?
Yes.
So you said, Marc-Antoine, for you, it's essentially the same. This, and you call this interpretation before. I don't call this interpretation. I call this removing, adding it is what it is. The user story is there. Now, like, why do you think this is the same user story as the other one where you would, well, maybe suggest what it is. You can try to write it and we can see whether or not it's the same.
Right. Well, I cannot write at this point.
You can dictate, all right.
No, but I don't see it as another. So, okay, I'm not saying it's the same user story. I read they're different conceptually and in terms of user psychology. But I'm saying the underlying mechanism is the same. In the sense that we have a claim that is ambiguous, whether it's usable or contextual.
Okay.
Okay, we have the broader claim and the more specific claim.
But isolated claims and contextual claims are inherently different.
Yes and no. I'm saying they share. They're two subclasses, but they share. Or actually, for me, a contextual claim is an object that encapsulates the decontextualized claim, which may or may not be standalone. But these are.
Let's try to write up
a
contextual claim first, and we can see whether or not we can easily replace it with usable claim. Let's maybe go about it that way, and then we can see whether or not there's problems with doing so.
Right. What I'm saying is, in both cases, as a, let's say, contributor, I am claiming, or I'm introducing that a certain usable claim is a valid interpretation / precision. It is a more specific and standalone version than another claim, which may be standalone or contextual. It doesn't matter. So that the usage is, so that any usage of the contextual claim, of the broader claim, of the interpreted claim, we should get a suggestion to use the more standalone claim, the more precise.
So now all of a sudden you have contextual claims in the claim repository, so all of a sudden you have non-isolated claims that, because you have let's assume you're suggesting that a contextual claim should replace a isolated usable claim as a more specific version. Like the usable claim was being used as a premise of a conclusion. The premise could be interpreted out of context. Now, all of a sudden you're saying that, hey, wait, not only do you have to look at this premise, you have to look at this contextual claim, and as well as the author that stated it, etc., etc., etc. So again,
I mean, you can't reproach me for confusing the two contexts while I'm trying to explain why the two contexts are essentially the same. I'm saying, yeah, they're essentially the same because the underlying operation is the same. Now, of course, if I'm trying to explain why the underlying operation is the same, I will mix the objects in my super context. Obviously, I'll do that. That's not a problem.
Okay, but so let's go. I want to say that a contextual claim undefined.
No, a usable. Here it's a usable claim. Here it's a standalone claim.
That a usable claim is a more specific
interpretation of a claim.
A claim undefined,
which could be usable or standalone.
You mean contextual?
Sorry.
So let's call
Yeah.
it the unification of the both for the time being. As contributor, I want to state that a usable claim is a more specific interpretation of a contextual claim, so that
anyone viewing the broader claim will be directed to, will be invited to choose one of the more precise standalone versions.
okay, so I get this, but I wholly disagree that this is a user story I want to support, because I don't want to replace in the CDL claim repository a usable claim with a contextual claim. That's the whole point. That the CDL is supposed to be a collection of isolated claims that you can interpret outside of any context once you start adding premises, essentially, because that allows you right now to replace an isolated.
Okay, I don't think that what I'm proposing here obviates the case for the CDL as containing only standalone claims.
Okay.
What I'm saying is, conceptually, there's this abstract operation of this is more specific than that, can operate on either. And I perfectly can understand that a repository can choose to only deal with standalone claims. That's fine, but it may get to see on the, I mean, there's two operations.
Is this even true, rereading this now? Can it ever be the case that a isolated claim that can be interpreted outside of any context is more specific than one that has the full provenance of where it's stated? I mean, it seems like a nonsensical operation to me. I would by default argue that any contextual claim is going to be more specific by its inherent nature, that you have the provenance where it came from.
Interesting. In a way, that's true. Fair enough. But what I'm saying is, it's still an interpretation. It's aiming to be more specific in that there is. No, that's a good point. But
that's why they're different. That's why you can't just intertwine them, even though in an abstract sense, yes, it's the same operation, but in a user story sense, it's about specifics. Would you ever say that
I think you're mixing definitions of the word specific.
Could be, but yes and no. I hear the objection. It makes sense, but I still think what I'm saying makes sense. Unfortunately,
let's try to understand it then.
What I'm saying is, even when you're looking contextually, there's a bit of could this sentence, even in context, be understood in more than one way? That's the real question, right?
Okay. Let me try something if that's the case, because I agree with you there. You want to provide multiple opposing interpretations, and one interpretation can be more specific than another. Okay, let me try to write that up. Okay, but I'm with you. What I wouldn't say this is the operation you're doing. What you want to say is there's this one interpretation, essentially. It's a new concept we haven't defined, but if I would summarize it as an interpretation. You have a source, like the user story wrote up here. We have the fragments, and we have the interpretation, which is probably a usable claim. Like the source is interpreted as a usable claim. You want to say that these three things together, like I'm going to replace the usable claim of these three with a more specific one. Like you're saying.
No, that. But do I want? Yeah, well, do I want to do that? What I may want to do, which is simpler, is simply to have two interpretation triples.
Yes, exactly.
But that means I'm not pointing to the triple. I have just two separate triples.
Yes.
Which means that the contextual claim is ambiguous. I'm marking ambiguity by marking the presence of multiple interpretations.
Okay, I think this user story on line 5 doesn't exclude the fact that you can do it multiple times.
Exactly.
So already
Correct.
this entails
And
it.
that's
So
why
what
it's
you're
the same
hinting at
thing.
is there may be multiple. So you want to say, as a reader of a media source, I want to view multiple interpretations of a given fragment of a given fragment in a media source. That's essentially it. So that
I may try to resolve them, or I may try to point out the ambiguity, or I can do all kinds of.
So that ambiguity in the interpretation, it's not, it's a different user story, but okay. So that ambiguity in interpretation
Is explicit.
is made explicit. I agree with this one, but that's something totally different than. I mean, we can try to write up the nouns here, right?
No. But what I'm trying to say is if this comes immediately from the possibility of doing multiple interpretations in line 5. And what I'm saying is this ambiguity of specification is fundamentally the same intellectual operation as ambiguity of specification when you've done line 6 many times. Doing line 5 twice or line 6 twice, you're saying, here's a sentence, contextual or standalone, which has multiple interpretations. And this is how I'm saying those stories are the same.
Yeah, okay, sure. There's an abstract concept of having multiple interpretations, but that doesn't mean it's the same music story. It means that there's an abstract concept of having multiple interpretations.
I never said it's the same user story, but I'm saying at a fundamental level, there are user stories that manipulate the same notion of interpretation. I'm saying interpretation in 5 and ambiguity in 6 have the same properties, even if, though I agree, they have different user stories, but they have the same formal properties.
There's no interpretation in 6.
Yes, it is. There is. What I'm saying is
there's no,
when I say
the noun is not, interpretation is not mentioned in 6.
No, but I'm saying what it's there implicitly. When I'm saying I'm introducing a usable claim as a more specific claim, blah, 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 I'm saying this is usable claim is an interpretation of the other usable claim. It's the same formal notion of interpretation. There's something that can be interpreted in many ways, and we're saying, here's, let's pick one and explain how it is different from others.
Yeah, I think these different types of interpretation are distinct enough to not call them the same thing and model them the same thing once we get to modeling.
Okay, so tell me how they're different, because I don't see it. Apart from living
they're
in
different in the
stories.
sense that in 7, for example, one fundamental difference is that probably the author here will be the final authority on to decide what the correct interpretation is, even though there can still be disagreement on whether or not that is a sensical interpretation. That's one thing, like the notion of a sensical interpretation and not at this point is dictated by the author. There's some involvement of the provenance, which you don't have in the other one. Like there, it's more of a.
In general, it's true, Stephen. I will just raise the counterexample of dog whistles, where you have competing interpretations and the author will deny one of them, though it is a correct interpretation.
Yeah, a more consistent interpretation with everything else that was stated before by the author. I agree with that. But all of these are actions that are totally outside of scope for 6.
I agree.
In that sense, they're totally different operations and probably will require different modeling.
No, what I'm saying is they're not out of, the question is, can someone in good faith have that understanding from reading that sentence and in this context or absence of context? And what I'm saying is from the reader point of view, it's the same operation. It's true from the writer, we can ask the writer, did you mean this? And you'll get an answer that is part of the information. So it may be a lie. It's still part of the information. But in the case, the fact that can a reader in good faith understand this from that is always a relevant question to ask.
But yeah, it's a question of scope, right? Because once you pull in contextual claims, then there's no boundary to making that decision.
The way I would think about it is that you can distinguish between an argument over what did the author mean. You can argue over what is the author claiming, and then you can argue over what we should do. Like you can argue over whether or not we should seize capital from the capitalists, and you can argue over what Karl Marx meant. And those are two different arguments. And when you argue over whether we should overthrow the capitalists, you can cite fragments of text from Marx or not. You can cite fragments of text from Marx and interpret them differently than Marx intended them. What he cares about doesn't matter in that one. And then when you have the argument over what claims is Marx making, then you're really specifically talking about that. Both of those have fragments of text and user-made claims. That's kind of how I.
That's all true. That's all true, Joshua. I agree that in one case, the authorial intent matters, and in the other, it doesn't. Yes, that's a difference. What I'm saying, it's an accidental difference because we're still speaking about the act of a sentence can have multiple meanings, and we're trying to see which different meanings are applicable. The fact that in some cases,
But
some
the operation
we
of
want to
doing that is
restrict.
different.
One second, I'm not done. The fact that in the case of a contextual claim, we may want to restrict ourselves to the meanings that are plausibly applicable from the author's standpoint. Okay, that's a restriction, but it's still the same operations as what meanings are applicable. What multiple there may be multiple interpretations, and if so, which ones are plausibly applicable? And the rules of what's plausibly applicable change a bit, but it's still, can someone have meant that? And the someone changes, but the operation of can someone have meant that is exactly the same. The fact that a someone changes, like any reader in good faith versus the author, and because the question of the reader's interpretation never disappears, it can just be subordinated or not to, do we care more about the author than others? That's an accident of the fundamental operation of, is this a plausible interpretation of that?
I suppose I just hear that as a good subject for an argument to be made on the CDL. Like, it sounds to me like not a feature of the CDL, but rather a topic that could be explored with vast network. You could argue over what did Marx mean, and you can use vast networks of claims and bring to bear all of the other features of the CDL. It's like a content topic to me.
Yeah. There is.
I was just going to add to that perspective, which is, the sort of the way I thought about it when I understood more the need for contextual claims is it's sort of a shorthand, because there's a lot of stuff you want to do when you're proving an interpretation that are, you want to base it on other things within the text and that sort of thing, and doing it within just a standalone claim approach gets very clunky, right? You want special tools that help you debate an interpretation.
And that way I understand that it's out of scope for CDL. Let's be clear, I'm not contesting that. What I'm contesting is, I'm saying these are fundamentally the same operation on a slightly different domain.
Right.
The function, or should I put it, let me put it in functional terms. If we think of standalone claims of a subset of all claims, including contextual claims, then the interpretation on standalone claims is simply a restriction of the function of interpretation on all claims in set theoretical, mathematical.
I don't know. I mean,
I gotta jump, guys. Nice to see your faces and hear your voice.
Next time.
See you later.
See ya.
Yeah.
For me, the key, I understand that there might even be a mathematically expressible fundamental same operation, but I mean, you're essentially arguing the abstraction is meaningful. Just like we're arguing, or I am arguing at least, that no, you need to pick a more specific noun here. It's exactly what we're modeling. Like, I don't think contextual claims and isolated claims can, in every user story, be exchanged that easily. The whole point of, at least why I first thought of isolated claims, was because these are some of the requirements you need to have something as a CDL work. Otherwise, that it falls apart.
It's
So
a
my
strict
question is,
subclass. It's a strict subclass, so of course not all, not everything that applies to one. They're not interchangeable if it's a strict subclass. Yes.
so wait, strict
subset.
subclass. Which
I
direction
have to
is that?
go, guys.
See it,
to
Timothy.
go.
What direction is that? Then you mean that all what?
I'm saying standalone claims are a strict subclass of claims in general, and we
Yeah,
could
but
take
we haven't
contextual
defined
claims.
claims. So yeah, okay. Okay, so we have a common non-defined root claim, but
Yes.
like standalone claims
Two
aren't contextual claims,
disjoint-
and contextual claims aren't standalone claims.
Yeah, and with
Okay, so
disjoint
then we agree. Then you understand why
and
I
I'm
don't think an
saying-
operation as having like saying that one claim, the superclass, is more specific than another claim is useful, because I just highlighted you one use case which I don't see what that means to say that a contextual claim is more specific than, for me, saying one claim is more specific than another among two usable claims is an entirely different case than among two contextual claims. While sure, the interaction, the interpretation, the action might be abstractly the same, but the result and why you would want to model that are entirely different.
And what I'm saying is, if you define it on the superclass, there is no. Let's put it this way, and I really should do a set theoretic diagram here, because it is possible to think of the
what becomes possible is that you can intermingle them. So the question is why? Why would you want to say that one contextual claim is more specific than a usable claim? And how should that be represented? What use cases does that support?
What I'm saying is, well, is a more specific interpretation. Well, it's precisely the use cases there, saying I have an object, a claim, an arbitrary claim, and I'm asking, okay, what are possible interpretations of that claim? What can someone reasonably
which claim is
this?
it? Which claim is it? Because are you
either way,
no
explicitly.
if you define a contextual claim, next time we need to define contextual claim, it might resolve this. If you define a contextual claim as a media source, like a link or whatever, a URI, the fragment, and a reference to a usable claim, if you're then saying what are multiple interpretations of these three things altogether, are you really talking about that contextual claim as a whole?
I'm speaking about, and this is why I said I'd have to be set theoretic, because I'm speaking of the interpretation of the fragment.
Exactly. It's a fragment. It's not a claim. It's a fragment.
It's also a claim.
It's not even a claim. It doesn't even have the restrictions. We know that a piece of fragment might not even be formulated.
No, a generic fragment doesn't, but a fragment that has been interpreted as a usable claim.
But then there's a usable claim.
No,
you're no longer...
the fragment, what I'm saying is the fragment, because it's been interpreted as a usable claim, is a generic claim. Because we have accepted non-usable claims. And I'm saying the fragment is a
is the fragment a claim, or is a usable claim you link to the fragment a claim?
What?
Is the fragment a claim, or is a usable claim you link to the fragment a claim?
I'm saying because we linked it to a claim, and let's assume that the link was valid, then that means the fragment is also a claim, probably indexical. Probably not standalone, probably indexical, but it is a claim. If it had not been a claim, we could not have linked it correctly to a usable claim.
The fragment can be interpreted as a claim within the full context when that's valid. The fragment on itself is not necessarily a claim. So if we start to define contextual claim, and I'll put it on the backlog for next meeting, I think some of the disagreements here and clarities will become clear.
Yeah, I need to make a set theoretic diagram of this, and actually it will be very helpful to do so.
What you're arguing is that, yes, the fragment within a media source has multiple interpretations, which can be expressed as multiple usable claims linked to the same fragment in the same media source.
Yes. And I'm saying all those are interpretations pretty much in the same way that the link between two standalone claims is an interpretation.
Except that here you're talking about interpretations of fragments to usable claims, and in the other you're talking about interpretations of usable claims to usable claims.
Exactly.
Yes, the interpretation act is the same, but that doesn't mean that
that's a restriction.
That doesn't mean that any fragment can be suggested as an interpretation of a usable claim.
I never said that.
Exactly, but if you swap them out, and because right now we essentially replace contextual claim with fragments, that is what you were saying. You were saying that a contextual claim can be suggested as a more specific form of a usable claim.
A contextual claim? No. I said the other way around. I'm saying I agree totally that the
I understand what you want to do. I understand what you want to do. We still disagree on whether or not there's a useful generalization there.
The codomain of the interpretation arrow, sorry, I'll speak category theory, is usable claims. But the domain is claims in general, including indexical or non-indexical. It doesn't matter.
Except that it's not a claim, it's a fragment here. The operation you're doing is on a fragment.
Yes, which in this case is
So
by
yes,
hypothesis an indexical claim.
If interpretation is an arrow, whatever you want to call it, yes, I agree. It can point from a fragment to a usable claim, and it can also point from a usable claim to a usable claim. But it cannot point from a usable claim to a fragment, for example.
Which I never said. I agree
exactly
totally with that.
Hence,
I never said that.
Okay, but hence it's not meaningful to express that as a user story where you make some abstraction overarching the unification of fragment and usable claim and say that these both can be made.
If you read my abstract story, okay, which one was it again?
But it relied on undefined notions of claim. That's a problem. That's, I think, why we need to define contextual claim.
No. Reread line 8, not 7, 8. As a new, no.
No, I wrote this after understanding what you were trying to do. I agree with this.
No.
What you wrote before was something akin to, as a reader, it's essentially the same as this one.
Oh God, it's lost. Damn it! But what I'm saying, what I did say is
this one here. You just wanted to say claim, essentially usable claim or
usable claim. Usable claim as a more specific claim of another claim. I had.
But what is a claim? Claim is not defined. What is a claim here?
Yeah, the union type of usable claim
exactly.
is contextual claim.
So I'm saying no, that it's not of another contextual claim as far as I understand.
No, and I'm saying I want to introduce one usable claim. The codomain is usable claim, and the domain is the union type. So no, it's. I think it is. I said what I said, and what you said. It's not what you said. I said.
It's. I think the general operation here, when you introduce one usable claim with a link to a contextual claim, that is the interpretation. That is literally you're saying this. It's forming what we would call a contextual claim. You're saying.
Yes, absolutely. It is. I'm saying the creation of what you call the triple, the fragment, blah 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 blah.
Which needs a name.
Yeah, yeah. I'm calling those statements right now in my work because I need a name for the triple, and it's not perfect, but and the arrow from indexical claim, that is a fragment which happens to be a claim, to standalone usable claim this arrow forms the statement, and I'm saying it's the same kind of arrow of interpretation that is used in the.
No disagreement on the kind of arrow. No disagreement there. So
And
I'm
that's all
with
I'm
you
saying,
there.
really.
Okay.
That's what I'm saying. Really.
But that only gets you so far in modeling. Well, I mean, but okay, I agree with you that the kind of arrow is the same. But so there's still limitations between which entities you can draw that arrow. It can be drawn between anything.
The question is, in certain systems, which will have only usable claims, when you look at anything that can be interpreted as X, you'll have only standalone claims. And in other systems, you'll also have contextual claims, right?
So no, I can't imagine the usefulness of any system where you would have usable claims interpreted as contextual claims. That's I don't see that as a meaningful.
No, that's not what I'm saying.
Okay.
I'm speaking about the inverse arrow here. It's like, okay, what
I don't
could
see
be
any. Okay,
interpreted
the
as
same.
this?
I don't see any use of a system that supports saying a contextual claim as a more specific form of a usable claim. I don't.
Which is not what I'm. Which is not what I'm saying.
So usable
Which
claim is more. Okay, just state it again.
I have a usable claim, and I'm saying, okay, what arrows led here? What does it come from? What's the inverse function? What could be interpreted as this? And what could be interpreted as this? There'll be ambiguous standalone claims, and there will be contextual claims.
So that's
that
7.
Can be interpreted as this standalone claim. And
That's 7, right?
Yes. Yeah. No, that's the other one. That's it's many to many, right? I keep saying it's many to many. There's many interpretations of the fragment, but it's also true that when you look at the interpretation, which is the standalone, usable, minimally ambiguous claim, you can say, okay, what are all the possible ambiguous claims that could have been interpreted as this? Some of which will be standalone, some of which will be indexical.
Yeah, I think I need to see it written out full as a user story
Yeah,
in an abstract sense to like.
I need to write the bloody category diagram.
Yeah, but it will make sense regardless to prioritize introducing all of the concepts that we're using quite loosely right now in the current discussion into the glossary. I think that will help.
Fair enough. Okay.
This one might actually be a good one to go next. I think we can move 5 to.
Yeah, no, that is useful. There's no question that this is useful.
So, okay, then we know what to do next time. Thank you for the discussion as usual.
And sorry for being pig-headed about this. But
no problem, no problem. Let's see whether we understand each other next time.
Yep.
All right.
Ciao, ciao.